Okay, today's date is the 11th of May 2021. My name is Shane Jackson and I'm interviewing Caroline for the Memories Captured project. So firstly, can you tell me how you got involved with traditional arts and crafts?
Sure. That's mainly because I studied archaeology. So in France at first, as I'm French and I do live in England now. So basically studying archaeology, you encounter an awful lot of objects, artifacts, and they are usually broken. You see them in museums. If you don't study archaeology, you can see them in books and films and all sorts of things. But you also are brought to think about the life of people in the past. And for me, it's the distant past. I usually work and research the Iron Age. So in England, in Britain, it's 800 BC to 43 AD, and other time periods. But it's this kind of questions that really got me into traditional heritage and ancient crafts, particularly the myths attached to early history or even medieval history, with this very common idea that people were not very bright, unclean, ate always the same bland, terrible, samey food, didn't know how to deal with diseases, and all these sort of things that really doesn't make sense when you look or research or just hit the history and archaeology button, and that really drives me crazy. So I wanted to get more into living history, which to me is the best way to interact with any form of audience and share this passion, I would say, but the the will that I have to show how we know about history, even the distant past, and the general public doesn't. Research has this type of barrier that people don't go and read huge books or go to conferences or even visit museums, and that's quite a lot of people. So to bring it to a wider audience, demonstrating a craft or skills or even daily life, by being in historical recreated outfits and producing items or showing people how simple things were done at the time, as far as we know. Yeah, I think really was the best thing for me to do.
Yeah, as a historian, I can completely agree. It's always easier to engage people when it's so much more accessible to them. Yeah. So how did you start learning about the craft that you practice with pigments, with food, and with a little bit of blacksmithing even?
A bit, a bit by chance, and then by challenge. I started with the food, and it's still one of my main specialties, I would say. So it's this very common idea that I mentioned, that food was always the same, bland, terrible, and if you didn't eat it, you were just dying or starving. Um, it's incredible because at the same time, sometimes in the same lesson, you just learned how amazing and varied agriculture was and how it developed so early. And it just didn't make sense at all. Um, so from there, I started um, very to challenge myself because I never cooked before doing historic food. And I started by Roman food, which is the oldest one I could really find, with actual recipes and recipe book and cookbooks that had been written and translated that were period accurate. Prior to the Roman period, you really dive into archaeology and you have to look at objects, seeds, charred, so burnt remains, and all these sort of things, and you do not have text, which now I absolutely prefer. It's it's even more complex. So I really prefer earlier time periods. But starting with Roman food and just practicing. At the start, just in modern kitchens, trying different ingredients, different recipes, then trying to recreate the ingredients with historical techniques, then ordering and acquiring replicas of pottery or metal items and all these sort of things, and then using them on an open fire. And really, it is practice. And I have been incredibly lucky to be part of a very welcoming living history group at the start. And that really gave me an awful lot of opportunities to learn and practice without any pressure. And then from there on, I worked at Mary Arden's farm in Stratford-upon-Avon, which is a Tudor farm. So forever set in 1573. So I had even more opportunities to bake bread and pies and everything in a bread oven every week, to brew ale how they did at the time and everything. Really, that was a life-changing experience. And for the other crafts, it just came from it. Once I've done food, you have to question how people were living around that, how they were working outside, what clothes they were wearing. And it brings so many questions. And the public you meet is always asking questions you never thought about. The best one is always from children. Where do they go to the toilets? Actually, an excellent question. And then, can you do everything you want to do in that dress? Yes, weirdly enough, cleaning pig pens in a dress works incredibly well. But that's a lot of luck, I find, with me. Otherwise, just experience and not hesitating to just try it. Maybe maybe now looking at videos on YouTube, for example, starts a lot of craftspeople, even in ancient crafts, and just communication, asking people, asking museums, reading a few books, and all these sort of things will give you the first key steps to just have the confidence to try it out. And if you like it, you will continue and you will get better. And if you don't like it, well, at least you know, you know, and you can find something else. And for the blacksmithing, very simply through this living history group and at Mary Arden Farm, I met Tom, my partner, Tom Timbrell, who is a professional blacksmith and historical knives replica maker. So we just met and recreated that old story that every Tudor village would probably have had, which is the maid disappeared with the blacksmith.
The tale as old as time.
It always works.
Yeah, I definitely agree that being inquisitive is the first step to learning and being inspired by a lot of these things. So apart from looking at the actual history itself and those sources, where else do you draw inspiration from? Do you sort of look at the environment or people or even other projects?
A bit of everything, weirdly. There's a lot of what people call ethnoarchaeology, but it is anthropology, ethnography, and looking at how people really nowadays, right now, are living in other parts of the world. Because everybody has different traditions that all in all are all very similar. So looking at, very strangely, but documentaries and programs on TV got me to think about rural Chinese food traditions, for example. And that is incredibly interesting, but also somehow similar to the rural traditional food traditions in Eastern France, which I come from, because they are mountainous regions. So we process cheese, for example, or dairy in very different yet kind of similar ways, if it makes sense. So looking at tribes in Africa, for example, is to me incredibly interesting because they are very strangely very similar to the kind of how can I say that? There's a feel to Iron Age tribal life, tribal or communities. It doesn't have to be a tribe as per, but the things I see in African tribes and the documentaries from the 90s, 50s, for example, if you manage to find them online, really gives that incredibly similar feel. It is. I say incredibly quite a lot now, but it is very, very interesting. And of course, you have to try not to fall in the traps of comparing traditions and ideas from completely different environments. For example, in Africa, you don't have the amount of water you can have in Britain, for example. But there are comparisons to be made, and humans are just humans. They have always been the same. Um, it's also something that not everybody agrees on, which surprised me very much so. But we didn't change in 2000 plus years, and that's just the Iron Age. We surely didn't change that much since way longer than that. People had friends, people were in love, they had children, and they loved their children. There's no questions about that. They lived off the land, there's agriculture, there's crafts. That's just the normal life of everyone on this planet. So conclusions can come from anywhere. And I learned more, I think, from people I met or people I might meet in person at some point, sharing their ways of living or sharing their ideas of a craft or a technique than I learned through half the books, maybe, that I read.
Yeah, talking to a lot of people who practice other crafts, experience tends to be the top factor in becoming good in their fields. You know, it's not reading things in books; it's actually getting out there and doing things. So, what do you think are some of the things that could encourage kids to start practicing traditional crafts and to start getting those kind of experiences?
I would say having a go, even a tiny little thing, can really put, I think, people at ease and just start them thinking. Because if you never ever consider that you might one day in your life, say, try to thatch a house, a reconstructed house, or try your hand at making paint from a rock, you might not get that idea by yourself. It's not something that modern life will just give to you. Well, modern life under our latitudes, if it makes sense. So I would say that, and that's what you find in museums, in forest schools, or in days out in visiting historical sites, or even sometimes digs and things like that. But it's also things that you will get through meeting people, or that your grandparents might know about. It's all about having that experience that somehow will light light something, will light that candle that you might have in mind and not know about. Um, it's for me, for example, I mentioned the thatching because I never thought that, having done archaeology and cultural heritage management studies and things like that, I would get to participate in the making of an Iron Age roundhouse, repairing Stone Age thatched buildings and things like that, or work with farm animals. It's just not something you think about. But there's a lot of very simple things you can do and people can do, especially nowadays with all the internet and all the information that you have on. I particularly like videos myself because I'm a visual learner. So if I read something in a book, it doesn't click in my mind that I can do it myself. I can learn a principle, but if I don't see it done, then it doesn't work for me. Other people are different. But just yesterday, I was doing some butter making and cheese making just sessions with a scout group outside of the village where we live because we have enough, so why not? And genuinely, the parents were fascinated as much as the children because nobody thought they could make butter by hand from cream at home with no equipment whatsoever and in, well, less than 5 minutes.
So with your involvement with, I want to get this right, Hario Gallico?
Perfect.
Awesome. Love the name, by the way, the Gaelic Cauldron.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you have much competition from more commercial businesses who do demonstrations?
No, actually, or not that I know of. That's that might be a good point, actually. Um, it's it's quite niche in any case to be a professional living historian. I think um, it's um, it's different. Reenactment is a hobby, and living history is a hobby as part of reenactment or as a um, I should have started that. So the difference between reenactment and living history, that's what reenactment as a word is reenacting, reacting something. So reenactment is meant to be the recreation of something that happened, a battle, for example. But if you do reenactment and you present daily crafts or arts and crafts or things like that, this is called living history, basically bringing history to life for the public. Now, these are very popular hobbies, and I really hope that they will develop and that there will be more and more, and that museums and historic sites will go there because they are an amazing platform for heritage craft to be revived and to be seen to inspire more people. There's very few opportunities to actually see heritage craftspeople in action unless you have festivals and demonstrations and markets and things like these. And living history and reenactment really are incredible for that. Now, as a professional living historian, I have to um, I have to make money from it. But it's not something that many bigger companies than one or a few people do. So it would be more a form of competition, I would say, between reenactment slash living history groups who might be 10, 20, 50, 100 plus members and go to events with a lot of people and professional living historians who might be by themselves, who might be with a friend or a partner, or might be a tiny group. The problem is, as we are professionals, then we might charge uh, the same amount, or a bit less, it really depends, but we might charge an amount of money that seems much more than a group that will turn up with 25 people. So that's another quest explaining that, yes, but that's the difference between hobbyists, which are, don't get me wrong, very often amazing people, extremely knowledgeable and everything, and sometimes a bit less. But as a professional, you have to know everything. You have to also know how to interact with the public, how to speak different levels of um, vocabulary, how to talk to the public in a way that is understandable, entertaining, educational, and you have to be able to talk to somebody who will be 3 years old, somebody will be 83, and they might come from completely different parts of the world and not know anything about British history, or be specialist archaeologists and visitors that know exactly what they want to ask you. So it's a bit of a different kettle of fish, and on the other hand, not that much. So not a competition, but it's also a question sometimes.
Thinking about the way that you have to adapt on the fly to different audiences and different levels of education, what would you say are some of the biggest challenges you've faced in practicing traditional crafts and trying to educate people about them?
That would be, I think, there's two. There's when people don't know anything about the time period we are presenting or the craft that we are presenting. And that's sometimes a little bit of a challenge because you have to be very diplomatic at the same time. It sounds very logical for many people that, for example, for blacksmithing, if you put metal in a fire, then the metal will heat up, and that is what makes the metal malleable. And you can then work it with a hammer and change the shape of it. But you have to explain that to children. Though saying that, we have had to explain that to middle-aged couples, and that is both a bit frightening and really challenging because you cannot seem to be explaining something extremely basic to somebody who is older than you. Also because we're not craftsmen, haven't been 50 years in the craft, etc., etc. But you need to get that basic information across, and in a way that the rest of the audience doesn't either think that it's a bit too simple for them to stay and listen, or begin to laugh. It's always really hard. And I think the other one and the most complicated part of the job is that sometimes you have visitors and people who are interacting with you or you interact with them, and they just don't want to learn. They don't want to know, and they do not want anybody to tell them that their vision of the world or their vision of history is not quite right. Or that archaeologists discovered something that changed this side of history about 50 years ago and they just didn't read it in a book. So when people are just resisting learning, I think that that is a struggle, but you can't teach everyone.
In some ways, that links to my next question because I know there's been some sort of uncovering of evidence that prehistory sort of Homo sapiens would eat sort of starchy vegetables, and it's been a staple of diets like the paleo diet that you don't eat those kind of foods. So I'm wondering, what's the most sort of surprising development that's influenced the way that you practice your craft?
Oh, that is an amazing question. Wow. I think it is to come. I think there is Must Farm that we call now the British Pompeii. So it's a late Bronze Age site in the Fens in Cambridgeshire, and the reports haven't been published yet. But there's a lot of information on the website and their social media, and it is incredibly exciting. I don't usually dive much into Bronze Age. It's a little bit before my favorite time period, but saying that, I just started this year, so so we might do more Bronze Age. But this site will change and has already changed the way we see British prehistory and prehistory in general in a major way, I would think. They have already discovered the earliest, I think, wooden wheel ever found in Britain, and it's about 800 years before the previous one. So there's things like that, and textiles, so yarn, so wool, things like that, that are so incredibly fine. We had, or many of us didn't have any idea that that was done already in the Bronze Age. So we are at least 2,500 years ago. And they found so well preserved remains that they will be able to tell what was cooked in the pots that they found, what was stored, And they even found, if I remember correctly, an intact pottery with the meal still inside and a wooden spoon left in the pot. That's the kind of discovery that is almost unheard of. So for me, working on pre-writing, so really the archaeology of food, it's the type of discovery you are dreaming of. No one will contest that what is found in this pot was for eating. Whereas when you find seed remains or even traces, minute traces of grain or vegetables or even meat or things like that on an archaeological site, you can always say that has been left there, it was for the animals, or they used it as bedding or anything. But that will change everything, I think.
So, reflecting on sort of the years you've spent practicing the craft, what do you think are the most important lessons that you've learned from it?
Trying, just not being afraid of trying. There's so many questions about very ancient crafts like these, or even traditional crafts. I'm pretty much only interested in craft that can be done without electricity, with only proto-historic or very ancient methods and things like these. And there's not many people around who can actually teach these crafts. So a lot of it is looking at the small amount of evidence that archaeology provides sometimes, the tools you can find, and the objects, the end results, and try to piece everything together, talking to modern craft people as well, who have a much better understanding of such material or how that could be done and what you would need to look for in archaeology. It really is have a go and look at experimental archaeology. This really is an amazing way of working together, usually with many extremely talented people who are researchers as well. And you will all try something together, have different ideas, confront opinions. And I think, yes, that's it. Try and don't try not to stay just in your corner. Exchange with others, ask about it, and if you have a theory, test it out, but bring also to others and discuss it. Don't be afraid of somebody potentially saying that, oh, that's wrong, or that's not very good. If it's not very good and they're rude enough to say it, well, it's actually quite a good thing. You need to know, and they probably will be able to tell you more if you just ask them.
Do you think awareness of techniques like making butter by hand or churning cream, do you think that they've become more well known with TV shows like Victorian Farm?
Yes, very much so. There has been very, very good TV programs and documentaries and everything like that, but also, again, videos on YouTube. And a lot of people now have access to a huge amount of knowledge, but also this amazing ability that you now have with video, that is to see people do things. So yes, Victorian Farm, and there's Tales of the Green Valley, which is one of the precursor ones. There are many other ones, but really, yes, I do think that it will bring a much wider audience to think about history, to think about crafts, and to just produce an easier to share material.
And just following on from that, obviously, we've had the pandemic, we've had lockdowns, we've seen people rushing out to the supermarkets to buy flour and make their own bread. How have you sort of adapted during the pandemic where you haven't been able to teach courses in person?
It hasn't been easy, but it hasn't been too bad for me personally. weirdly enough, I didn't get much time because I work as well as an ancient technology tutor at the Ancient Technology Center, and we just didn't close because there's so much to build and maintenance to be done on reconstructed buildings and things like that that we didn't have the time or the need to stop. So on that side of things, for me, lockdown has been an excellent teacher, and I got the opportunity to try out quite a lot of new and different ancient skills and ancient crafts. So that has been pretty interesting. On the other hand, with no courses, no living history events, there's no interaction, there's no sharing anymore with the public or participants. And that has been quite harsh, actually. It's it's something you do because research is very interesting. It's the basic, the fundamental. But not being able to share that research, to me, not being in academia, really kills the not the interest, but the aim of it. I research for myself, but I really, really want to share it with people. And there are some things that I've researched during lockdown that I haven't finished, mainly about ancient paints and pigments. It's just a succession of rabbit holes you fall into and you never come back up, which is great because the world down there is fantastic. But that will now be turned into, or has been turned just recently into a new course. So coming out of lockdown, we'll have new things to actually show, demonstrate, but also teach to people. Though both financially, but also, yeah, I would say mentally, it has been pretty harsh.
Just picking up on what you said at the end there about new things, it's really interesting to see the ways that you've diversified from courses to demonstrations to even catering to live action roleplay.
Yes.
Is that all sort of a really organic process of just developing from demonstrations, reenactment, to then roleplay?
It started the other way around. when at uni and probably before, I've always been into not tabletop game, but paper RPG role playing games. So in a room and you have dice and extra, very Dungeon and Dragons, if you like, type of things. So I encountered LARP, so live action role playing game, a couple of times, a few times, and I have many friends who do that as a hobby, and it's incredibly similar to reenactment and living history. And I know some LARPers, participants, have better historical outfits and replica items that they use on their weekends with no public. This is the major difference. They are private events. They are not public events for interaction and education like living history and reenactment are. But there are LARPers out there who have better equipment and better historical outfits than many reenactors and living historians, which is fascinating to me because you have 18th century nobility kind of LARPs, role-playing games. But the point is, this is a private event for enjoyment with a group of people, whereas living history and reenactment, the key is to be sharing educational material in an enjoyable way with an audience. So having encountered everything like that, food in any case works everywhere for everyone. That's why I wanted to start by food as well. It will speak to anyone. It doesn't matter if you like it or not. It will be interesting because everybody eats. But historic food brings the question of ingredients and combination of flavors. And I'm not a chef. I'm merely a cook. But it's it's the kind of things that creates a completely different experience than the food we usually have, if you like. So when you cook a Roman meal and you use fish sauce even in desserts, it sounds really, really strange. But trust me on that, if you're not allergic to fish, it is delicious. But that's the kind of experience, and I like that word, it's an experience of the senses. You get closer to that time period, but it creates an out of normal, again, experience. So if you do laugh, you don't want anything to look like normal. You want something completely alien or fantasy or something like that, or something extremely historical, because that's the key. If you want an enjoyable laugh session, you have to be in that world. And food is a key for me to that. For the rest, I don't do that very often, and I don't really do any catering anymore. Saying that, no, we'll have some very specific ones, Iron Age, Bronze Age, and things like that. But for very special key events, and giving courses just came very strangely but naturally. I think somebody asked at the start, and we just adapt. It's a display with a lot more hands-on, of course, experience, and it's suddenly turned into full historical cooking courses, and now how to make ancient paints and pigments with prehistoric methods. It's all about experiencing archaeology in a way.
So before we wrap up, just out of curiosity, do you have a favorite memory of a particular demonstration or a particular course, or whether it's a child asking how do they go to the toilet, or whether it's teaching someone? What do you think your favorite memory has been?
I have it's horrible to say, but I have excellent memories of something I don't do much of anymore. It's Iron Age combat displays. So it's fighting with spear and shield, usually against my partner Thomas. And of course, I'm not extremely trained. I'm much better now, but I don't usually win. Let's start like that. The thing is, when you have somebody portraying an Iron Age Briton, so Celts, and being female and being much smaller than an opponent and really trying hard, you will always get the crowd to cheer for you. And it's not that you ask for it, it just suddenly happens. And every time everybody is very much into it. It's not just the children. You realize that suddenly the adults are yelling, leave her alone, come on, kick him. And it's incredibly funny. So yeah, that would be one of the best moments.
Everyone loves an underdog.
Yes, that's true.
So before we finish, is there anything else that you'd like to mention, or anything that you feel like we've missed?
No, that's, to be honest, as varied as it is for me, to find questions for me to answer with so many different things and that are not quite crafts but household crafts and things like that. No, maybe that it has been again very lucky for me to find so many people just to practice or to learn crafts from and with. And I keep learning, and I think that's the weird thing. But I've never, for the moment, found the craft, the one I would focus on all my life and go in depth, really in. I've done food, and there's so much more to learn and so much more to research. But suddenly, I'm very interested in paints and pigments. but asking questions about how did they make the paints on the walls of their houses? You have to ask the question, how did they make the walls of the houses? Suddenly you find yourself looking at building construction and things like that. And it's a really strange thing to think that I thought blacksmithing would be potentially the very much sought after, the one craft. No, I absolutely love metalworking, but iron or steel apparently are not the material that I prefer. So I just started learning a little bit more about silversmithing. We'll see.
Yeah, as a history student, I get lost down research rabbit holes all the time.
It's both the best and the worst. The one that you might find the answer to the question, but was it really the question you were asking? I'm not sure anymore. Well, these were excellent questions, I've got to say.
Thank you. No, it's really interesting to hear your side of things and how things have developed and grown.